Hello to everyone listening. Welcome back to Declassify, and this week we've got a great guest and episode lined up for you. From Melbourne, I'd like to welcome on board media artist and composer Ciaran Frame. Aside from the brilliance of Ciaran's work and practice that you're going to get introduced to throughout this episode, we're going to go on a very deep dive into the world of statistics and data, because if some of you haven't already caught this publication, Ciaran is the person behind the Living Music Report, a very revealing, albeit not so shocking, statistical report published earlier this year that unveiled the stats about the plateauing MPA programming choices in Australia. So now it comes to the little intro, which, Ciaran, I don't think I can adequately explain your classical music training and how it's led to your very diverse and very interdisciplinary practice now. So perhaps if you could describe how that development has happened.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Ciaran, and similar to yourself, almost exactly the same as yourself. My musical background comes through the Con and a Bachelor of Composition, and I guess my practice has kind of taken very dramatic turns since that time. I sort of nowadays see music as a sort of lens to view other concepts, whether that be scientific concepts or processes or data or really just any non-musical stuff. I think that's the way I view music, as a sort of tool to understand different things. But I guess I'm still sort of connected to tradition and my degree. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing remains to be seen. But yeah, I think I use the tools I have available to me to interpret other genres or other disciplines and see if anything interesting comes from it.
Cool. So how do you say you're going to use a data set to inform the music you're writing? How would you then integrate it and also select the ones that you then choose to integrate?
Yeah, I guess I select things or data sets or processes based on what I'm interested in. So if I'm sort of curious about a particular discipline or genre or sort of niche area of biology and I want to learn more about it, I tend to gravitate towards those data sets just because it's interesting. And if I want to learn more about something, then I think music is an interesting tool to use, amongst others, obviously, to sort of, just be curious.
So, for example, I mean, I know you're writing something about lichen now, or you were interested in lichen growth as a premise of a piece.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's about it's static, so it's just about lichen as it sits kind of in the environment, and that kind of came about through a residency that I did in Arctic Circle on a scientific research station in Lapland in Finland, which is sort of a very remote town on the edge of Finland and Lapland. And yeah, again, that was just something, lichen just was something that I was so fascinated by, with its little kind of ecosystems on rocks, and it's almost like an alien life form. So it's not like I set out to kind of write for lichen, but these kind of things I just become very fixated on. And sort of, I think there's so much kind of potential for musical works within those fields, particularly lichen.
Now I have to ask, did you write it for the lichen to enjoy, or are we as an audience listening to the lichen?
No, I think we as an audience are listening to the lichen. I guess it's not even about the lichen, because the piece is the lichen. So what the musicians play is the score, and so they're interpreting the lichen, and yeah, I guess it's a reflection of what the lichen is. But I guess, there's every chance that a lichen could be interested in hearing itself in the same way that you would write a programmatic sort of biographical piece. Maybe the lichen would be interested in listening to itself, but mostly it was to do with sort of sonifying these kind of ecosystems in Finland, and learning more about this interesting little quirk of biology.
That's really amazing because in a way it links to the previous episode with Alexis Weaver because she spoke about one of her projects which included writing music that frogs would enjoy. So for some reason I made that immediate leap that some of your work was not just a homage to the lichen but music that lichen would enjoy.
That's brilliant. I love the idea of, I think there's just so much sort of so much that we can learn from the natural world and sort of these different ecosystems. To be honest, I'm surprised there's not more of it out there. I mean, there's a lot, but biomusic's its own genre. But yeah, there's just so much out there, so much creative potential. Now I need to write music for frogs. That's
So now I'm just looking down at my piece of paper and I'm just looking at the question I've written down. It seems a little rude because it just says, "Do you like trees?"
I love trees. That's not a rude question at all.
Well, great, because it brings to mind another work that you did, and I think it was in Vivid Festival, and it was the one where it was really interactive and you could go and hug a tree and then it would light up.
Yeah, that was Tree Hugger. Yeah, I absolutely love trees. In fact, I'm writing a piece of trees right now. It may not surprise you to learn. No, I'm similarly obsessed with trees. There's a whole sort of rabbit hole that I've fallen down, sort of the social ecology kind of discipline that sort of looks at the way that we interact with sort of different organisms in our society, sort of in the city, even where I live in Melbourne. How do trees kind of change the way we behave, or how do they change our well-being? How do they change the city's livability? And are they perhaps ignored, or at least not as much emphasis is placed on them as if you see a possum in a tree, you're like, oh my god, a possum. But if you see a tree, everyone's just like, oh, it's a tree. So I think I love trees.
So then if you're looking at trees and interactions between ourselves and trees between each other and varying biological aspects, how do you then translate that into a musical language? Would you play around with notation or maybe even electronics?
Yeah, I think I kind of try to keep my methodologies pretty open to the circumstances. Like in this case, I'm looking at sort of sonifying trees through electronic music. So there's these wonderful, amazing data sets that the City of Melbourne releases that basically documents every single public tree in the City of Melbourne in this big open data set. And to me, that just screams like, every tree needs a little piece of music to go with it that can be sort of generated through different processes of sonification. And yeah, I think I guess to answer your question, it changes. I also enjoy sort of creating notation systems that are weird and slightly wacky. Maybe they sort of are based off the look of of bark on a tree, or maybe they're based off the position of trees. I think there's an infinite number of ways that you can sonify or create music out of trees.
So hypothetically, if you write music for every tree, would you then be able to interact with it when you physically go to each of these trees?
Hopefully. I mean, that's definitely one way that I was thinking, could you sort of sonify and then sort of bring this music to every single tree, or an interpretation of. Another way that I'm looking at is, now that everything's moving online, in the digital space, like, can you place yourself in different environments around Melbourne? At the moment, we can't travel outside of a sort of 5-kilometre radius from our place of residence in Melbourne due to the restrictions. But is there ways that we can kind of experience different parts of Melbourne that we can't access at the moment? Learn about different tree species, or learn about these little ecosystems through music that we maybe couldn't have otherwise done. I think there's some interesting conversations in there as well. I just think it's such a amazing field, and in a way it's kind of not undervalued, but there's just not as much work as I would expect there to be in these fields in terms of the collaborations that are going on. I think we as musicians have so much to learn from biology, whether it be biology, chemistry, physics, all these scientific disciplines. And I think to a certain extent, during these collaborations, I think maybe, the scientific fields have things to learn from music as well. Obviously, we're not going to discover the Higgs boson through a piece of chamber music, but I think, even just different ways of interpreting data or different ways of just looking at concepts or processes, I think there's just so much potential.
And it's great because it really allows the audience, if not, the musicians themselves, a chance to understand some of these seemingly untouchable or difficult concepts, like particularly in physics, to understand them from a different lens, which can be very useful and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, and it's, I think sometimes it's kind of music and science is praised as this way of sort of finding untapped kind of interpretations. I'm not sure it goes that far, but I do think it can add something to the field at least, or add sort of a bit of maybe personal meaning or social kind of relevance to these fields that otherwise just aren't being explored at the moment.
And it's not unheard of to combine the arts with the sciences. For example, like a very old and ancient example, but if you look at something like Plato's Republic, there is an entire chapter about how certain musical keys and modes are capable of affecting social change or behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, maybe we're going through a renaissance of of this kind of collaboration.
I mean, I hope it continues and expands, because even big institutions like CERN offer an annual artist in residence position, and in Australia we have this Antarctic expedition where you can go and work with scientists down at the base, and I even think Speak Percussion did it 2 or 3 years ago.
I'm not going to put it on the list. Yeah, it's going to get very big after this podcast.
Well, in fact, this is probably a good time for me to attempt to do a segue. So I was thinking about how to bring in your work as a composer into your other quite prominent work that you've been doing, which is the Living Music Report. And it does seem to me like data is at the center of a lot of your work. So how did you move from creative practice into what we have now, which is the report?
Yeah, I think you're onto something with the link between sort of data in my pieces and data in sort of other areas that I'm interested in. The Living Music Report came about not initially as a something that I was set on doing. I actually, it started because I was looking for an equivalent, which, as it turns out, does not exist. So I guess it was inspired by a lack of data and a lack of sort of big picture kind of views on our sort of contemporary performance landscape in Australia.
And how should I describe it to other people who haven't had a chance to look at it yet?
Yeah, so essentially it's a report that summarizes basically what everyone played. And when I say everyone, I mean all the major sort of orchestras of Australia, which kind of fall under this umbrella of what are called major performing arts organisations. And it summarizes everything that they played in 2019 on a public program. So whether that be sort of an outdoor gala or in the concert hall, I sat down and individually recorded every single piece that they had played, and it totaled to 2006 works in total, which is, yeah, I think it was worth it, even though it was a lot of manual data entry.
Well, it's actually an incredibly useful resource, because you're right in that it was lacking. I was trying to look for data before this was released, before you release this, and instead I found a very disconnected and disparate segments of the whole picture. For example, APRA AMCOS and AMC, but it was, their percentages are more related to the makeup of their representation and royalty divisions. And there were some individual company reports. For example, if you go to search for Musica Viva, you'll probably find the one from 2017 to 18. So thank you so much for doing this work.
No. And I think the other thing to point out is that there's very little sort of data collection and big picture in terms of these key areas that the report focuses on. So whether that be First Nations music or gender in music, in sort of performances, there's just very little information out there, in particular from organisations. It's very sort of selective sort of use of data on the organisation's behalf, and it's very selective use of data, and there's no sort of big picture because it's not in the organisation's interest to look at this big picture.
So to break this down, I'm just going to read out some of the primary statistics and figures for people listening at home so they get a picture of what is happening statistically. And it'll set us up for a deep dive into the stats a bit later. So basically, you've given an overview right at the beginning of the report about the MPA's function in terms of how much money they receive on an annual basis, particularly your notes on how much money they get via federal funding, which in Australia is the Australian Arts Council, and they receive a substantial chunk, and it's 61% of that funding.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive chunk of money.
Yes, and it's 131 million Australian dollars in the year of 2019.
Oh no, I should point out that that's all the MPAs. So that's not just not only the orchestras, but if you actually look at the orchestras and the amount of government funding that they receive in total, it totals to about $76 million last financial year. So that's still a fairly significant chunk of money for all the orchestras in Australia to be receiving, in my opinion.
Yes, and it's a lot of money because there are other MPAs, which, MPAs are inclusive of theatre and dance.
Yeah, that's right. There's also a discussion to be had in sort of the balance of MPAs. Orchestras are a massive part of the MPA landscape. And you look at something like circus, essentially has no representation in MPAs. Things like literature, peak bodies and those kinds of organisations have no representation. So I think, the orchestras definitely carry a lot of responsibility and a lot of weight in the decision-making process, which is an interesting thought.
Well, I didn't realise that they receive so much of the percentage of the national funding budget. And I just did the calculation for you, and it's 67% of the national MPA money goes to orchestras. Yeah. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's more than a super majority.
Well, yes, that's more than 2/3 of the national budget. Oh dear. Well, we'll be sure to touch on that and why that's significant a little bit later. But to go back to the report, you then, after providing this very big perspective, break down all of the percentages per category. So Australian composers, how many of their works were programmed, to female composers, to COLD, which is culturally and linguistically diverse composers, and all the way down to First Nations, right?
That's right, yeah. And also sort of living composers as well is another one that sort of was a metric that was sort of one of the key areas. Pretty self-explanatory, that one.
Hence Living Music Report. So after reading it all, I wasn't totally shocked by the results, but it was great that it confirmed my suspicions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely, that was definitely kind of the purpose of the report. I don't think anyone was surprised by the results, but it's sort of, it's the fact that the results now exist that I think is really important. Colloquially and anecdotally, we all know what the orchestras play. It's public knowledge. They advertise their programs every year. So it's no surprise in that sense. But what I think is really important is that sort of bigger, more sort of detailed picture that's really lacking in the performance landscape at the moment.
So, for example, the report shows the representation of female composers is 15%. Oh, no. Wait, it's 3%.
3%. That 15% that's very generous of you, but
well, I know internationally it's almost or around 15%, so I was hoping, but well, then we're behind.
Yeah, we're behind in essentially every area possibly imaginable. In fact, I think one of my favorite is the wrong word. One of my go-to statistics or facts is that Bach, Beethoven, Brahms and Mozart all individually featured more times than all female composers combined in the entirety of the 2006 works performed. which I think paints a pretty shocking picture of what the report kind of summarizes.
Before we get back to unpacking the results from Ciaran's living music report, our first intermission is actually from the work Ciaran described at the beginning. Please enjoy this musical work, which unpacks the ecosystem and life of lichen, which Ciaran worked on during his residency in Finland. This work is entitled Thallus. And I am now wondering why the statistics are this way, particularly what you mentioned with the big three in the report, Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart featuring more often. Because, for example, if you had done this report this year, I mean, I would slightly understand why this is the case, because it's Beethoven's 250th birthday. I mean, that's a whole other topic to get into. But considering your report is from taking statistics from 2018 to 2019, it's a little bit concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I I also don't think that, it's great that it's Beethoven's birthday and everything, but I don't also think that that's even a reason that, we shouldn't have these diverse this diverse programming embedded in these orchestras. I always say that it's, I'm not out to sort of destroy Beethoven. I happen to quite enjoy Beethoven, but I also sort of think that it's not the be all and end all. If maybe we just, cut a couple of Beethoven from the program as a start. I know it's his birthday, but please.
Also, it's his birthday at one point in the year, and we've dedicated an entire year to programming all of Beethoven's work internationally. Yeah. So why do you think, particularly in Australia, we are so fixated on programming these 4 major composers?
That is a really tricky question. I guess I don't know, really. It seems like a no-brainer on paper that you would have sort of these diverse musical experiences, but obviously history tells us that is not the case. I think it's a complicated issue, and I think it extends well beyond the scope of just orchestras and their creative directors. I think it extends to boardrooms. I think it extends to management. I think it extends to the way that orchestras function in society. And, it's not necessarily a problem that's unique to orchestras, but I think it's definitely a symptom of these broader problems with society.
Yeah, and perhaps playing safely to people's expectations because it is so difficult to turn over money if you're an orchestra or an MPA.
Yeah, I guess it's definitely, it's always, people always say, well, people expect a certain thing from orchestras, and, if the classic argument of it's risky to sort of program these diverse musical voices is, the tried and true kind of quote unquote reason that these orchestras play what they do. But I actually think that that's also not very sort of well founded in any facts. It's very easy to say that it's risky to program new music and sort of First Nations music or music by called composers, but one of the best performing organizations in the Living Music Report, they're still not a shining example, but they're one of the best, is ACO. And ACO's government funding is essentially nothing. Like they mostly rely on ticket revenue and philanthropy. So clearly there's an appetite for these kinds of experiences. And yeah, whether it's a risk or not, I'm not so sure. I think it's a lot easier to say it's risky than to actually try it.
And sometimes I wonder, what do they mean by risk? Is it purely financial because it could be difficult to sell a concert or make money through this way? Or could it also be seen as artistically risky, in that there is an implication that somehow the quality of the product or the performance will be compromised?
Yeah, I guess usually it's talked about in a financial sense. But then you look at, the government funding that these orchestras receive. Last year the SSO received $15 million of government funding. And, they say themselves in their annual report, we are reliant on government funding to operate as an organisation. So in my mind, surely that would provide some sort of form of license to take these risks. If not, then, what is this government funding doing?
Exactly. I've always thought that they would have a higher degree of responsibility to engage with living practitioners or local living practitioners if they are receiving this volume of money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's a shame that often the burden is placed on sort of smaller organisations, sort of small to medium arts organisations, or even independent artists, that the burden is placed on those groups to sort of pull the weight of these experiences as opposed to the people that receive the majority of government funding.
Well, now, I suppose we should touch on this issue of grants now that we've slipped into talking about government funding. And I know both of us had to fill out a grant or several grants at some point.
Yes.
Probably through the same funding bodies, our state one being Creative New South Wales or our federal one being the Australian Council for the Arts. And I'm sure many of you listening have probably been confronted with one of these really lengthy, detailed application forms. And if not, well, you're about to hear a lot about them. So as an anecdote, that will probably be a little bit helpful here. The last time I filled out a very thick application or grant, both for state and federal funding, I was confronted with about 12 questions interrogating myself and my collaborator about the cultural impact of our work. That means it's not just us estimating KPIs, which is, about audience, members, online, digital, national, international, but really detailed information about the cultural considerations of our work, ranging from diverse storytelling, the nature of our accessibility plans to translations, and how we wanted to work with regional audiences. Or, if we can seek collaboration and consultancy with First Nations communities and practitioners, how are we going to bring in these different audiences and other called workers and participants? And it was really long putting this together, and it was a very thorough application, all with supporting documentation required. In a way, I think it's really great because these funding processes make us and they force us as individual artists or small groups to think about our impact and the power of representation. And yet, when we get to these large MPAs like orchestras, I don't believe they're being probed in the same manner.
I 100% agree. Everyone knows the feeling. And look, I think that it's great that there's accountability in these small to medium grants and these independent grants. I think it's fantastic and it's a great model. But then you look at the major performing arts model and that kind of thing just doesn't really exist. I think it's interesting that you mention sort of accountability because I think that's definitely something that's lacking in the current major performing arts organisation framework. It's kind of just, it's very opaque in the sense that, if they do fill out these same forms, we never see them. And, if they do have KPIs, we never see them on an individual level. We only see them on a sort of broad basis and aggregate performance, essentially. And collective achievements, I think they call them, sort of, the highlight reel of the orchestras, which kind of reads like an annual report from all of the orchestras. It's like, look at all this great stuff we did. And, they do great stuff, but that's not what accountability looks like in my mind, especially not in terms of programming.
No, not at all. And to go into detail about this, if we move down, further into your report, what you offer is a detailed statistical look into what each of these MPAs are doing. And because you mentioned Sydney Symphony Orchestra before, I feel like it would be worth talking through some of your findings about there. So they're 2018 to 19. In fact, I actually went to this one performance.
I think I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah. So it was a single performance of one piece by a female composer for that entire year.
Yeah, so I think that concert is a fantastic little summary. And I guess this is the opposite of an annual report highlight. You'll see, SSO might say 33% of Australian compositions were by female composers, and that's because they had 3 Australian composers in the whole season. I think what the Living Music Report also tries to do is to look at these kind of more detailed sort of snapshots of the reality of these orchestras programming. And like we both know, there is some very interesting examples of these kinds of things, like, for example, replacing the only female composer in SSO's season with a different piece for the other 2 performances of a concert series. That absolutely just boggles my mind that it's not like a program misprint or like we forgot to sort of include that. It's an active decision to remove a female composer from an existing program. It just absolutely it's really it's unacceptable behavior. Like, what kind of message does that send to? And this was in a Meet the Music. That was in a schools program specifically designed to be sort of absorbed by students. And so they're telling students, actually, this female composer only belongs in one of 3 of these concerts. Like, that is just so unacceptable. It's almost like comic. It's unbelievable.
So the main thing is, I don't understand why that happened, because practically the orchestra would have to have made this decision well in advance. They don't just go,
Exactly.
oh no.
And, they talk about, we just talked about taking financial risks. They have to rehearse an entire different piece in addition to this piece just so that they can cut it from the program. It's unbelievable.
It's just bizarre. Also, that concert series had a female conductor as well. So, I mean, I don't really know what to say, although I did mention it to someone who worked in programming and concert presenting. And they mentioned that this used to be a really common practice in the 80s and 90s, having one new piece of music and then suddenly cutting it from the program and always having a backup piece prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a feeling of sort of how far can we sort of bury these diverse musical experiences in the program? Like, can we just sneak them in at the start? Where can we put it in the program that no one will notice it? I think that, the attitude towards these kinds of compositions is also comic.
And extends well past just the programming and into other realms like marketing. Like the chat I had with Carl Vine for another episode, he briefly retells being programmed alongside classic hits like Bolero in order for it to feel safe for the audience and probably for the orchestra as well. But it happened there.
Yeah, that absolutely does not surprise me in the least.
Well, have you had any responses from these MPAs since you've published it?
Yes. They've been fairly coy, I would say. And I think there's a very good reason for that. And I think it sort of ties into this idea of accountability. It's just not in these orchestras' interests to engage with these kinds of reports and to engage with these discussions. They'd rather just stay quiet or sort of, whip out the old sort of quick quote for the paper that we've, commissioned X amount of pieces, which is fantastic initiatives. I'm not saying that, how dare they commission sort of 3 Australian works. There's the Living Music Report isn't designed to sort of take these organisations down. It's designed to sort of create these discussions and make sure that there's data available to anyone that needs it. And it's just very easy for these orchestras to stay quiet and not engage with these discussions and just continue going about their business. And when they do respond, it usually sort of entails, the highlight reels of their the work that they do. And, they do some fantastic work. There's some great schools programs. There's some fantastic resources to do with Australian music. But I think when you look at it from a bigger picture and from a bigger perspective, the statistics paint a different picture to those highlight reels. And I think we need to engage with that just as much as we engage with the great positives of these orchestras.
So then if we look ahead from what you've reported on, do you think in the next coming years, or say the next decade, if they continue not to make some of these or take some of these statistics into account, or think about their role in terms of engaging with living people and new music, or just different voices, musical and non-musical, do you think they will begin to lose a potentially younger or broader audience?
I mean, from my perspective, I think they're losing all audiences. And I actually, from my perspective, I just see it as bad management of a company. That's very controversial, but I think these orchestras are not being managed properly because they don't provide these diverse musical experiences. And I think, a sustained kind of evidence base and sustained sort of hearing from diverse musical voices, I think that hopefully can contribute to the broader discussion and the idea that these orchestras are just not sustainable institutions unless they change what they do. And I think that sort of comes all the way down to even financial stability. I'm not just talking about artistic sustainability. I think, they're just not being financially well managed if they don't have these diverse experiences in them, because they're cutting themselves off from different audiences. They're cutting themselves off from different experiences, and they're cutting themselves off from really good music. And obviously they have a great weight to carry through through the centuries of classical music, but I don't think that's an excuse for not changing.
I also think it's an extremely reductive presentation of what classical music actually is. For example, the big four that you mentioned in the report: Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and Brahms. If we continue or repetitively reinforce this reduction, then it's a wholly incomplete experience of classical music. If we go back to their time when they were writing their music, audiences were constantly accustomed to hearing new music, as music was always being produced. But now we're in the 21st century and we're experiencing their new music from the 1600s and the 1700s.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not to say that the sort of, dare I say, ancient musical experiences don't have any value in society. Like, of course they have value, and you might like them, you might dislike them, but I think they have a place in orchestras. But yeah, I guess it boils back to the sort of idea of meritocracy and what the organization's value is, quote unquote, good music, whatever that means.
There's also the physical practicality to contend with when it comes to orchestras and how orchestral musicians have to work. There's such a tough schedule, so in Australia it's roughly a concert program a week, which then cuts down the amount of time they're permitted to play and learn new music and perfect it to the standard that they wish to for a performance because of the way it's run. And in order to turn over the money and in order to turn over, and this money in order to run the actual company. So there's a chance that this is inversely affecting new music or, taking a risk to try out new things, and instead, everything's just being branded as being risky.
Absolutely. MPAs never come out and say, oh, if only there was just easier new music to play, then we'd be playing it all the time. It's like, that might be a factor.
They hint at it.
They do hint at it. They hint at it in big terms like resources and commissioning. There's other ways to program these kinds of music that don't involve resources and commissioning.
Well, now that you've mentioned the word commissioning, it seems only apt that we move into a rather large part of the classical music world, which rarely commissions. And I must ask, why did you choose to leave out opera in the report?
Yeah, opera is a really tricky one. And it was an active decision to leave it out. For me, for a report that's purely focused on data and sort of the collection of programming data, I don't think opera it's very hard to paint a big picture of opera just in one sort of year's season. So for example, the 2019 summer season in Sydney for Opera Australia, I think it had 5 classics, so like La Boheme and all that kind of jazz on repeat essentially. And yeah, and your Mozart and your, just wheel out the classics. But because there's such a limited scope for the programming, if they were to sort of have one Australian sort of commission or one Australian work in the mix, it suddenly sort of tilts the seesaw sort of wildly. So I think maybe on a year-to-year basis, there's not a whole lot of point sort of looking at sort of the bigger picture, except for saying, look, where's your Australian work, or where's your work by female or non-binary and gender diverse composers? Like, obviously it's not there, but I guess the bigger picture is already there really in opera. We know, because you could just take a look at a one-pager in a program book and go, yes. Whereas for the bigger orchestras like Sydney Symphony and Melbourne Symphony, you can't just kind of glance and say, oh, well, how much Australian music did they play, or or how much First Nations music did they play? And so I think that's where the Living Music Report sort of really comes in, is that bigger picture, when you can't just take a glance kind of thing.
That makes sense. And it's true that they did just commission, and I think it's the first time it's happened in a decade, but they commissioned a work by Elena Katz-Chernin, the Whiteley Opera, and then they would come and say that it's 20% of their music is new and by a woman because it was the 1 in 5 operas for that 1 year.
Exactly. And then I'd never hear the end of it. They'd be like, we have 20% of all... But look, I'm not discounting the fact that opera could be included in the future. I think there's definitely scope for it. But I also think there's some really good sort of amazing discussions happening at the moment in that space as well. The sort of gender equity in opera, the summits in consultation with OSCO and APRA AMCOS and the AMC. There's some really interesting and like so valuable discussions that are going on there.
Yes, that's true. I think is it Sally Blackwood and Lisa Lim that are pretty much spearheading that movement?
Yeah, and Kat Hope, I think, are all sort of, and just every time I read a single paragraph from there, it's just such an invaluable discussion and so inspiring. Their language and their stories and their vision as well is just blows my mind. It's so inspiring.
For our second intermission is a piece entitled Botsot. This work is also about trees, but this time about the Japanese flowering crabapple blooming and exploring the changes of state when it is blooming over spring by using contact microphone recordings and a drone maker. So coming from all of this research, I did actually read some of the articles that came out after you reported everything, including the one in the Age where the SSO representatives sort of did their thing and gave their highlights reel in the middle of the article, which I thought was very funny. But, you know, they are commissioning 50 new pieces this year.
This is true. And again, like, I would just point out that, like, you know, I think these are brilliant initiatives. I'm not sort of downplaying the importance of these initiatives. You know, it's just the data. They could respond in any way they wanted. I didn't say they weren't commissioning people. I didn't say they weren't, you know, locking composers in a cupboard. Well, I didn't say they were locking composers in a cupboard, but yeah.
I mean, I hope rather that this gives them perspective in terms of what their priorities are as a company and hopefully how they can improve and where they can go. Obviously, I mean, not this season or the next. First, because everything's been cancelled by the pandemic, or, you know, next year because they tend to set things at least 3 years in advance. But I really hope that after this and during all of this, that they actually have a think about how important their role is to advocate for the representation of different people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's, you know, the Living Music Report doesn't exist to sort of be a leader and sort of commenting on the scene. I like to comment on the scene, but, you know, I'm an individual. The report's kind of just its own thing. I think that it's the start of a conversation that doesn't necessarily, you know, come from me, a young white male composer. I think it comes from other voices, and it comes from a momentum that, you know, data is one element in that mix that hopefully builds to or amounts to some form of change.
So I have a weird question now. I just thought of it. So if it's, say, a company that specializes in hip performance, which is historically informed performance, or they just play repertoire from a certain period, should they even try to engage with living people other than living performers?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because obviously the worst performing organisation in Living Music Report was the Brandenburg Orchestra, and, you know, that's not particularly surprising. However, I was actually quite surprised that they were the worst performing organisation, because they have actually commissioned quite a lot of new work in the past. And I think, you know, there's sort of wild scope for even a historically informed performance to sort of explore different ways to integrate diverse musical experiences into their program. You know, there's some wild things that they've done in the past that have actually been really sort of fascinating, engaging concerts that involved living composers. And so I guess it also comes back to that idea of meritocracy. And, you know, if you're saying that, we only do historically informed performances just because, well, that's not a very good reason. But I think a lot of people think, they're saying that because it's somehow better than living music, or than modern music, or whatever you want to call it, which I don't think is true. And I actually don't think that the Brandenburg Orchestra thinks that's true either. You know, and you could argue the same thing about non-historically informed performances. So, you know, SSO, in a way, they're doing the same thing as the Brandenburg Orchestra is doing. They're only playing Beethoven, Bach, Mozart kind of thing. So in a way, it's not that dissimilar.
And, you know, coming from this, and now we're talking about specific organizations, I was having a think about how your stats have related to, or in a sense been at odds with company statements, because I've always questioned whether or not these statements are, you know, actually helpful or promote action, because most of them, quite frankly, are hollow and just performative. For example, the LSO statement in reaction to the BLM movement in the UK was about how they as a company were going to invest in increasing aspects of diversity across the whole company. And if I'm going to be frank, I just checked and I can't actually find that statement anymore. But I should, if I do, I'll link it down below for everyone.
Yeah. It really does kind of ring hollow. I think the MSO, I've written it down here. The MSO has another sort of cracking line that I think is just really disappointing. What they said, that's right. It's the MSO key change pledge. it's dot point 2 that says, brace yourself, work towards appropriate gender balance and representation in our concert seasons. Like, that word appropriate, it just makes me gag on the inside. Like,
what does that mean?
Like, what does that even mean? And is appropriate just there so that they can say, well, you know, we just thought that programming 4% was actually the appropriate number of gender representation for female composers. And look, I do think that there's some good examples as well about these things being active in organisations' management and in their minds. Is something like the BBC, who sort of have internal codes and like commissioning codes, and they're not based on funding or sort of demands from external organizations. They're just essentially a series of principles, and it's what they expect from themselves as well. And I think that's really important because the expectation bar for orchestras in Australia is non-existent. Like, they don't expect anything from themselves, so they don't deliver anything from themselves. And they have some like really fantastic, the BBC has some fantastic commissioning codes of practices. One that I really like is they look at kind of, out of all the commissioning we do, let's look at sort of that section of the pie chart kind of thing. So, you know, we have a broad range of content, but out of the commissioning we do, what can we change in that sort of 10-20% that makes meaningful change? And, you know, I think that's lacking in organisations in Australia as well, is the what they do with the 10-20% of living music as well.
And also looking at it statistically, which perhaps I don't think they were doing internally. I don't know if I can say that, but I really doubt that they were looking at it internally. But I suppose you provided a report for them, so they cannot escape it now.
That's right. If they weren't before, then they have no excuse now.
Thank you so much for doing this report, by the way. It's been incredibly useful for me, and I'm sure it's going to be incredibly useful for other people as well.
I hope it's helpful. I think that's why I made it, is because, I just want it to be there for people to reference, for people to use. And also, I should point out that the data used in the report is part of an open data set, which is published under the Open Data Commons. So anyone can use it. Anyone can recommend changes. If I made mistakes, which, you know, if it's up till whatever hour of the night watching Netflix and reading a program, then I may have made mistakes. But it's open to corrections. I'm yet to receive a single correction from any major performing arts organisation. So looking for, you know, if they have any comments or suggestions about the data, but hopefully it's accurate. But it's open, so anyone can use it. Anyone can make another report about it. Anyone can form their own insights.
And it's been out for several months, so I suppose they would have said something had they'd noticed a rather large discrepancy.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I did also email them to bother them to see if they noticed any, which most chose to promptly ignore.
Well, that's not a surprise either. In fact, my favourite line in the whole report is this one line. More pieces have the word violin in them than were written by female composers.
Even if it changes their sort of... Yeah, I think that's another really important thing. Even if it changes their language and like the way they talk about things. I think another line, was it West Australian Symphony Orchestra had a blog post. That's right. Attention women, men, non-binary and gender diverse people. It's time to celebrate. And clearly they think the celebration comes through performing 0 works by female and non-binary and gender diverse composers in their entire season. It's an interesting way to celebrate, but, you know, each to their own, I guess.
Actually, I'm on their page now. Oh gosh, oh no, their pie chart's rather depressing, isn't it?
Yeah. It's not great. Oh, in fact, you can't even... Oh no, that's right, because it was 0. I was going to say you can't see the little segment in the pie chart, but that's because it doesn't exist.
So actually, what did the SSO end up saying in their annual statement? I don't know if this is going to be in the podcast because it's now just me rereading the report back to you.
I'm all for it. That's right. They said, we include Australian compositions in all our programming, and this features works by female composers, which the idea of including Australian compositions in all programming, which in my mind means that it's in all the things that they do, is an interesting interpretation of having Australian works in 5 of the 52 concert programs that you performed. Again, a very interesting interpretation, but it's perhaps a valid one. I'd let people make their own minds up about that.
Is it not just like these statements are not just kind of like, in a sense, a marketing tool to protect themselves?
Absolutely. It's kind of a sort of Kevlar vest that they can put on, because these statements can be interpreted in a number of different ways. So it's not untrue that it, as Wazo says, it's time to celebrate. That is not an untrue statement. It is time to celebrate, but unfortunately, it's just not reflected in what they do, which is not the way I would express these kind of little vox pops. But I do think it's definitely a way of deflecting some of the criticism that they might receive, in my opinion, at least.
So just thinking about looking for season reports, like what I said at the beginning, when I was reading through documentation prior to talking to Carl, and I was looking for Musica Viva season and annual reports, I could find 2017 and 2018, when it was almost and sometimes more than 50% of commissions from female composers. And then the report mysteriously goes missing in 2019.
Yes, that's the other thing. It's just, what we receive, aside from the Living Music Report, is what the organisations want us to sort of receive. And, they're not going to put, Musica Viva isn't going to put that they only had, 8% of their compositions by female composers. They're never going to include that in their annual report. So, which is why I think it's, important to have these kind of external metrics, because otherwise we'll just never hear about it, even though we know the truth.
Yeah, from just attending concerts and sometimes looking around and seeing the same audience members every single time we're at a concert.
Very true.
Now, sorry, I'm reading it again. I thought this was a good point, which I should have mentioned earlier, but you mentioned in the report that the average year of performed or program composition is 1885.
Yeah, or even sort of, looking at the distribution of when works were written, because sometimes it doesn't quite come out in, living and dead is a pretty crude way of looking at it. I think it's an important way of looking at it, but there's other ways to look at it. So, for example, the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra, 65% of their works performed were written before 1900. Even though they had sort of 11% living composers performed. So there's definitely different ways to look at it, and sort of distribution of when was something composed, or not just are they alive or not.
So this is really my final question, and a very important one. Are you going to do this again?
Yes, absolutely. It's going to be interesting. So the idea is that it's a annual thing, so it comes out every year, and obviously 2020 is just an absolute trash pile of a year, but I think there's still some interesting insights to be had. So I am collecting the data still. It's a lot easier to do as you go rather than all in one, like I did for the inaugural report. And I think there's some equally interesting insights to be had for sort of digital performances or online performances, and things like that. And spoiler alert, COVID has not been the fire starter you would think it would be for diverse musical experiences. I know, it's a shock to everyone.
I was actually hoping that it would start some conversations just because we have more time to think, but perhaps not.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's just a no-brainer, even from a management perspective. You have the time, you have the resources, you have smaller scale ensembles, you have the ability to take risks. You're already taking a risk when you're putting content online. What's another Australian work or another First Nations work going to hurt, really? These MSO is yet to charge. In fact, most major performing arts organisations are yet to sort of formally charge for these digital experiences. And yet somehow it's still considered a risk to sort of program this kind of music. It's just a wasted opportunity in my mind.
Oh, I think so too. It's because we're still celebrating Beethoven's birthday.
It is.
It's all Beethoven, isn't it?
It's all Beethoven. That actually will just be the entirety of the 2020 Living Music Report. You'll just open it and it'll just say the word Beethoven. And it wouldn't be that far from the truth.
Oh, it's a shame. But I'm so looking forward to the 2020 Living Music Report. I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to you for joining me today and being so willing to talk about your practice and this very significant report.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for your very insightful questions.
I mean, well, I hope that they were, and some were just personal questions that I found particularly intriguing as I was reading your research. So I hope they're actually helpful for anyone else who's also listening along.
Well, in the same way, I hope the report is of some interest or help, I guess.
Well, I will definitely make sure that people will be given the link to the website and PDF of the report so they can access it themselves and have a read of it. And on that note, another thanks to Ciaran for joining me and talking about the power of stats, from biomusic through to MPA programming. And again, all the information about Ciaran's work and the Living Music Report will be popped down below and in the transcript. Thanks so much for listening, and catch you all next time.